Okay. So I'd like to begin by wishing you all a good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are, whenever you happen to be listening to this. And we will begin as usual with the prayers of refuge and bodhicitta. So I'd like to ask you all to please recite these prayers with great faith and devotion, keeping the meaning in mind as we recite the words. O sangye chedan soge chonamna chancho bardo dane chapsum che dage chenin jibe sanam jirola penjur sanje drobar sho sangye chedan Soji chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum chi dagi chenin gibe sunam gi drola penjur sanje drombar sho sanje chedan Sogi chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum chi Dagi chenin gibe sunam gi dola penjur sanje dubar sho until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha Dharma and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha Dharma and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha Dharma and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Semje and Tamje Dewa Tan Dewe Judan Dembra Juji Donga Dan Donga Ji Judan Rawa Juji Donga Mebe Dewa Tampa Tam Min Rawa Juji Nirin Jadan Nitan Rawa Tanyon Chambola Nebra Jurji. May all sentient beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be parted from the highest joy, which is free of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free of attachment or hatred for those near or far. In the Dharma Expanse Palace of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas of the three times who shows me directly in my mind as Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted Guru. Please bless me and all sentient beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. And now please think to yourselves that we need to achieve happiness. We need to achieve freedom from suffering. And temporary freedom, temporary relief from suffering is of course good, but suffering will return. And so it's important for us to try to find the ultimate release or the ultimate emancipation from all suffering, which is the state of Buddhahood. And if we reach it ourselves, then it wouldn't do not to reach a state of permanent happiness if we didn't bring all of those beings who have been so kind to us to the same state ourselves. And so we must think that we should bring all sentient beings to the state of enlightenment, and please thus listen with the motivation of bodhicitta. And the Dharma that we are listening to is the Treasury of Abhidharma by Vasubandhu, and as explained by the ninth Karmapa Wangchuk Dorje in his commentary, Youthful Play. This commentary has, the Treasury of Abhidharma has 8 chapters. And so we're discussing the 7th of these, the teachings on wisdom. And the teachings on wisdom, this chapter has 4 parts: the knowings, the explanation of possession. The 3rd is how knowings are attained. And the 4th is the qualities of the knowings. So we are discussing the 1st, the knowings. This is discussing the 10 different types of knowings, the defiled and undefiled knowings that we have, that we can have. So this section has 3 topics: the distinctions between forbearances, knowings, and views, identifying the 10 knowings, and examining the distinctions between the knowings. And so we are discussing this 3rd, the distinctions between the knowings. So in the distinctions between knowings, there are 4 topics: distinctions of the 10 knowings, distinctions of the antidote, distinctions of aspect, and explaining other distinctions. And so we were discussing the last one, explaining other distinctions. Where did that go? And this has these sections on, what is it? Where is it? It's aspect and display. Oh, okay, so that's right. It's after the section on aspects, and so therefore we are, where did that heading go? Oh, there it is at the top of 507, explaining the other distinctions of the knowings. This is 5 topics: distinctions of essence, that is virtuous, unvirtuous, from neutral. We discussed that yesterday. The distinctions of level and the distinctions of support. We went through those 2 yesterday as well. So today we have come to the section on the distinctions of the foundations of mindfulness, which is on the top of 500, page 508 of the book. So the distinctions here, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, we're basically saying, well, but before I get into this, actually, there are some questions that I should, that came in last night that I should address first. So let me take a look at those first. And so there, one questioner with 2 questions, actually. And the first one is that there, in chapter 6, we talked about the 37 factors of enlightenment. And the question is, why of the, there are the 37 factors, there are also the 6 paramitas. So why, among the 6 paramitas, are patience and generosity not listed among the 37 factors of enlightenment? And so the main response to this is that actually, where the 6 paramitas are actually not as, what do we say? They're not emphasized as in the practices of the foundation vehicle as they are in the Mahayana. They're taught. There are teachings on them in the Theravada tradition, and they're taught, of course, in the Treasury as well in chapter 4. And so here, though, when we're talking about generosity and patience, generosity and patience are primarily practices we do in the post-meditation. Whereas the 37 factors of enlightenment are primarily things that we meditate on in actual equipoise. So I think that is probably the reason why they're not listed in the 37 factors, among the 37 factors of enlightenment. That seems to me to be the most. It's not explained exactly why, but if you take a look at it and you think about it, what is generosity, and when did the Buddha perfect generosity? Well, the Buddha perfected generosity, or the Bodhisattva, I should say. The Bodhisattva perfected generosity finally 100 eons before achieving great enlightenment by sacrificing his body to feed a starving tigress, and so forth. So that is a practice that he did on the path of accumulation. And he wasn't meditating on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. He wasn't doing any of the meditations. He was actually just, walking around in the forest. He saw a tiger. So definitely a post-meditation activity. Also, we have patience. When you are need to be patient is not so much when you're sitting around, sitting meditating, because then you're pretty peaceful. It's when you get up and you have to deal with other people in your post-meditation. So I think that is probably the reason the rest of the 37 factors are primarily things that you do in the course of actual meditation. Now, I think we can wonder about that with the Noble Eightfold Path, because of course, right livelihood and those would also be post-meditation factors as well. But that's the reason that sticks out me for the main thing. But the other point is that the Buddha taught different things in different situations, and the 37 factors of enlightenment groups it in one way, the 6 paramitas or the 10 paramitas just groups it in another, and so there's some overlap. Another way you could look at it is that the 10 paramitas are actually included in the 4 foundations of mindfulness, because the 4 foundations of mindfulness include all phenomena. So that would include patience and generosity. So then the second question here is a less pressing question, but something that struck me, the questioner writes. It was mentioned a couple of times that knowing one other's minds takes effort. I take this that this is described knowing here is not the same as what we translate as clairvoyance in the Mahayana. I always thought of clairvoyance as being a byproduct of samadhi and characterized by having gone beyond dualism, therefore produced without effort or will. So here it is, knowing others' minds or telepathy is actually one of the 6 different types of clairvoyance. Now, of course, there might be different translations. Some people translate this term that I translate as clairvoyance as super knowledge. So whatever, but it's one of the 6 different types of this, the 6 different types of knowing, the 6 different types of clairvoyances, which are described later at the end of this chapter. So it actually is one of the types of clairvoyances, and all of the clairvoyances for learners take effort. In other words, you have to go through a step of training to produce them. But when you get to be higher faculties, like the Buddha, as we spoke about with the telepathy on the path of seeing, the listeners and the Pratyeka Buddhas are unable to know others' minds, all 16 moments of another's mind during the path of seeing, but the Buddhas are, because the Buddhas don't need to train. So here it's implied that those of higher faculties don't need to train. They don't need to go through the preparations to enter them. They can just jump right in. So it's like they don't need to warm up first. Most meditators need to warm up before you can generate the clairvoyances, and the Buddhas, and presumably also in the Mahayana, bodhisattvas on the pure levels and so forth, don't need to warm up. They just start right in. So that is, I think, that question. And also there are probably other distinctions between the Mahayana and the foundation vehicle approach. And generally, when you're talking about if you're only eliminating the afflictive obscurations, but not eliminating the cognitive obscurations, you of course still have certain obscurations left from the perspective of the Mahayana. And so that would make sense for why it would be more difficult to develop the clairvoyances. So we will now go and start talking about the text today. So here we're talking about the 10 knowings, and this is actually a section, and we're talking about the distinctions. And so we're starting from the one that's on the bottom of your screen right now, distinctions of the foundations of mindfulness. So what this is talking about is, if we want to know the knowings, we need to kind of be able to distinguish one from the other. And one way to do that is say, well, which can be which foundation of mindfulness? So here we have the root at the top of the screen. Cessation mind is one foundation of mindfulness, and knowing minds is 3. Those which remain are 4. So to read the commentary, well then, which of the foundations of mindfulness do these knowings have as their essence, you say? In other words, you're doing your meditation practice when you have these knowings. And so You're sitting in equipoise, and so you're meditating on the four foundations of mindfulness. So which is it? So the essence of cessation mind, that is knowing cessation. And it notes here in the auto commentary that mind, knowing, and prajna are all, in this context, synonyms. So they wouldn't be synonyms elsewhere, but here in this verse or in this passage, they're considered synonyms. So the essence of the knowing of cessation focuses only on non-composites because it's looking at cessation. So it is the one foundation of mindfulness of dharmas. And why is it only dharmas? Because the non-composites are dharmas, but they're not body, they're not feelings, and they're not mind. It is, so they're only in the mindfulness of dharmas. And because the minds that know each other's, know others' minds, that is telepathy, only perceive concurrences. Concurrences here, it means mind and mental factors, which are concurrent with each other in 5 ways, as described in chapter 2. So they're concurrent in time and substance and so forth, and focus, and so time, focus, support, and so forth. So they are the 3 foundations of mindfulness, other than mindfulness of body. Because when you're being telepathic, you're looking at someone else's mind. You're not looking at their body. You're looking at their mind, right? So that's why they're and you can look at any of the substances of mind. So that would be the mental factors, which would be the mindfulness of feelings, or the mindfulness of mind, or the mindfulness of dharma. So it could be any of those 3. And those 8 knowings which remain, that is the Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing, the knowing of the suffering, origin, and path, and the knowing extinction and knowing non-arising, are any of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, because they can really focus on anything. So depending on what they're focusing, that determines which foundation of mindfulness they are. So that's the distinguishing them in terms of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Well, now when we think about them in terms of the focus, that means which ones can look at which knowing can see or can observe or focus on another. So how many knowings does each knowing have as its focus? That's the first part. 9 are the sphere of Dharma mind. That is, the Dharma knowing has 9 other knowings as its object or sphere. 9 of the path, it's similar, and subsequent mind. So the subsequent mind is the same as Dharma mind, it's just a different realm. And 2 of suffering and cause. So suffering and cause can know 2. And 10 are of 4. So 10 knowings are 10 knowings are the object of 4, and none of 1. So this becomes clear as we go through the commentary. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly this morning. It's actually not as difficult. When you read it at first, it sounds like, what the heck are they talking about? But it's actually not that difficult. You just have to think a little bit. And when you think, I think it becomes clear. So how many knowings are the focus of each knowing, you ask? 9 knowings are the sphere of Dharma mind, or Dharma knowing, because relative knowing is the object of Dharma knowing of suffering and origin, and the 8 undefiled, except for subsequent knowing, are the object of Dharma knowing of path. So you've got the 9, so Dharma mind, if Dharma knowing can have different types. And if you're focusing on suffering and origin, you're looking at the suffering and origin in the desire realm. So you see relative knowing. And in the path, you're looking at basically 8 of the undefiled knowings, with the exception of subsequent knowing, because that is on a different level that it can't observe. 9 knowings other than relative knowing are the sphere of the knowing of path, because that takes on an undefiled object. Now, path can happen on any level. The knowing of path can happen on any level. So, but it can take any of the different 9 different knowings as its object. But relative knowing is defiled, so it does not know that. And the object of subsequent knowing is the 9 other than Dharma knowing as above. So it knows 9, excluding Dharma knowing, and it can't know Dharma knowing because it's on the desire realm, and the subsequent knowing does not focus on the desire realm. And two, relative knowing and defiled knowing of other minds, defiled telepathy, are the object of both knowing suffering and knowing origin, its cause. So the knowing suffering and knowing origin can know either Dharma knowing, can either know either relative knowing or defiled telepathy. No. And all 10 knowings in order are the object of 4 knowings. That is relative knowing, telepathy or others knowing others' minds, knowing extinction, and knowing non-arising. So these 4 can focus on any of the 10 different knowings. This is because the object of relative knowing is all dharmas, that is all phenomena. The object of knowing others' minds is all concurrences, that is all mind and mental factors. And knowing extinction and non-arising are partially dharma knowing and partially subsequent knowing. And so, all of those 4 can focus on any of the 10 knowings, and then none of the knowings at all are the object of the one knowing cessation. So knowing cessation doesn't know any other knowings. The reason why is because it doesn't know any composite phenomena. It only knows the non-composites. It is looking at cessation, which is non-composite, so it cannot know any of the knowings which are composite. So then the next subject is which subjects focus on how many dharmas. It probably should be how many instead of many dharmas. I have to look at that. And it starts by saying there are 10 dharmas to apply. The 3 realms and the stainless and the non-compound are twofold each. So here there are 10 dharmas into which knowables can be divided. So you can classify knowable phenomena in many different ways. So here's another way of dividing all knowable phenomena into 10 different categories. And then you can apply the knowings to them to figure out which of these categories each of the different knows, even the different knowings knows. Now, so to explain it, it says, to know how many are the object of each of the knowings, apply them. So the way that the dharmas are divided into 10 is that the defiled 3 realms and the stainless dharmas are each divided into concurrent and non-concurrent, and the non-compound has virtuous and neutral. So they're twofold each, or divided into 2. So that means you've got desire realm, you've got form realm, formless realm, that's 3, right? 3 realms. Then you've got stainless or undefiled, that's 4. And you've got non-compound, that is 5. So that means, and each of these can be divided into 2, so that is 10. So that's how we get the number 10. How do we divide them into 2? Well, with the desire realm, basically you have 2 categories. You have mind and mental factors, that is the concurrences, and everything else, which are the non-concurrent. So this says so they're divided into concurrent and non-concurrent. Concurrent means mind and mental factors. Non-concurrent means the anything other than that. Any what do we say? And this is going to be anything composite that's other than that. So that is going to include physical form, any of the 10 categories of form. It's going to include the non-concurrent formations, such as arising, staying, perishing, attainment and non-attainment, and so forth. The non-concurrent formations that are discussed in chapter 2, attainment and non-attainment, and so forth. So these are the things that are the non-concurrent. So there are those 2 categories in the desire realm. There are those 3, and the same way, there are those 3 categories in the form and the formless realm. Now, in the formless realm, you don't have the 10 categories of physical form, but you still have the non-concurrent formations. So you still have the 2 categories there. And then with stainless or undefiled dharmas, then there are the ones that, then there are the non-concurrent ones, which are like discipline. And then the current ones, which are the knowings. The mind and mental factors on the desire. And then for the non-compound, there's a virtuous and neutral. So virtuous would be the analytic cessation. That is the cessation that you achieve through the power of your meditation. It's called analytic cessation. It is discussed in the first chapter. So analytic cessation, and then space and non-analytic cessation are space of non-analytic cessation are neutral. So non-analytic cessation is just basically an absence of something, or something that's not going to happen again. The classic example given in the text is when you're looking the other way and a crow flies behind you or sits in the window behind you. Then the crow flies away and you turn around to see the window. There is a cessation of any eye consciousness that could see that crow sitting in the window because the crow's already flown away. And that type of cessation, you're never going to see that crow in that window because it's already gone. There's a cessation of that. It's not anything, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just neutral. So that's the second type of cessation. So again, that is described in the first chapter. So there are two for each. And so then you have to look at which of the different knowings knows each of the different categories. And this is described in the auto commentary and in some other more lengthy commentaries, but Wangchuk Dorje doesn't go into detail on it. And I think I'm going to follow Wangchuk Dorje's lead and not go into it in depth today. I think that actually, again, this is something you can sit down and think. Okay, well, we can go through like one. If you take like one of the knowings, you can think, well, okay, well, which one can relative knowing know? Well, we already know that relative knowing can know all phenomena, so it's easy, right? That one knows everything. Then you've got Dharma knowing. Well, what can Dharma knowing know? Well, it knows defiled and undefiled dharmas of the desire realm, right? And it also knows cessation. This is the analytic cessation. So, and similar with the subsequent knowing and so forth. So you can go through for each of these different. The subsequent knowing be similar. It can know the subsequent knowing can know the suffering. This can know the phenomena of the form and formless realm. So it would know 4 plus the cessation, so that would know 5. And similar. So you can go through each of these and think of each of them. So that's an exercise you can do if you would like. How much one knowing knows? So how much can you know with one knowing? In this verse, it is a what do we say? Okay, so that's it. So how much one knowing knows? The stanza reads, the couplet reads, just relative knows what is outside its own collection to be selfless. So relative knowing can know all phenomena except for itself. So when you're doing the foundations of mindfulness on the path of training or the path of joining or in the path of accumulation, you haven't got Dharma knowing or subsequent knowing. You're meditating on them with the relative knowing. So you have a conceptual idea of them of this, and you have a conceptual idea that everything is selfless. And so you can know everything outside itself, except for itself, it can know to be selfless. As the commentary says, can one knowing know all dharmas, you ask? It cannot. So there's no phenomena that can know absolutely everything. However, just the relative knowing knows all dharmas that are outside its own collection to be selfless. Outside of its own collection, what do we mean by that? Well, it explains here. Here, its own collection is its essence and the dharmas that are simultaneous with it. So this would mean there's the relative knowing that has the mind, it has the prajna, all of the other mental factors. It has its attainment. It has its arising and perishing and so forth that are all associated with that. So it can't know that, but it can know everything else. So any given moment of relative knowing can know everything except itself and everything that's working with it at that moment. So that's what we mean by its collection. Because their object is separate from the subject. In other words, and because they're separate from their focus and because they're extremely close, they do not see each other, just as the eye cannot perceive the eyebrows. So when you have relative knowing, an object and a subject have to always be separate from each other according to the Great Exposition. So this is why, it's like the famous example, a sword cannot cut itself. If you're going to know something, you know something else is the great exposition position. Of course, in Mahayana, there are different explanations of it. Some accept the same explanation. Some say that there is self-awareness, but that's separate. And here we're saying that mind cannot know itself. And because they're separate from their focus, so there's a similar thing. They are focusing on something that has to be different from their self. And because they're extremely close. So the mind and mental factors and the attainments and so forth associated with it cannot perceive each other. Just as the eye cannot perceive the eyebrows. Until you get older and your eyebrows grow extremely long, you cannot see your own eyebrows. But for most of us, we can't see our eyebrows. My grandfather probably could have seen his, and in a few years I'll be able to see mine, but not yet. Or you could say that you cannot see your own eyelids, is another way to say it. You can't see them. So that completes the first major section, talking about the knowings and talking about their nature, talking about the distinctions among their knowings. So now we have come to the second major section of the chapter. And the second major section of the chapter is only one stanza long, the explanation of possession. And this reads, on the first of undefiled moments, those who are attached possess one knowing. On second, 3. After on each of 4 moments, they have another. So on the first of undefiled moments, that is the Dharma knowing of forbearance, if you are attached to desire, that is, you haven't achieved the jhanas yet, then you have one knowing. You don't have 2, you have 1. You have relative knowing. You don't have Dharma knowing yet because that arises on the second moment. On the second moment, you have 3 because you have Dharma knowing, you have that relative knowing, you have the Dharma knowing of suffering, and you also have Dharma knowing and the knowing of suffering. So you've got 3 different things. And after, on each of 4 moments, there are 4 different stages where you each gain another one. So to read the commentary, which individuals possess how many knowings? Now here, when we're talking about possessing, what we're saying is, we're not saying necessarily using at that moment. We are saying possessing. It's not necessarily meaning that they're manifest each moment. It means that you possess them. So which individuals possess how many knowings, you ask? An ordinary individual who is attached, still in the desire room, possesses relative knowing alone. And if detached, they also possess defiled knowing of mind or defiled telepathy. So of the nobles, there are those who are on the first of the undefiled moments. That is the Dharma, the first moment of clear realization, Dharma, forbearance of suffering. Those who are attached possess the one relative knowing. They have no relative knowing, just that one, but not any other, because they haven't achieved the undefiled knowings yet. On the second moment, they have Dharma knowing and Dukkha knowing, or knowing of suffering, are added, so they have 3. That second moment is Dharma knowing of suffering. So it's Dharma knowing and it's knowing of suffering, so they have 3, relative Dharma knowing and Dukkha knowing. So they have these 3. And after that, on each of 4 moments, the 4th, the 6th, the 10th, and 14th, they have another knowing. So on the 4th moment, what is that? So the first moment is Dharma forbearance of suffering, Dharma knowing of suffering, subsequent forbearance of suffering, and then the 4th moment is what? Subsequent forbearance of suffering. So on that moment, well, they gain a new one, and what do they gain? Is they gain knowing. So they gain subsequent knowing. That's the first moment that you have subsequent knowing. So now they've got Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing, relative knowing, and knowing of suffering. So they have 4 knowings. Then you go through the next moment is what? Oh, it's Dharma forbearance of origin, right? So Dharma forbearance of origin, that's a forbearance. So you don't gain any new, it's not a knowing, so you don't get anything new. Then the 6th moment is what? Dharma knowing of origin. So at that point, you finally know the truth of origin, or you, for the first time, you know the truth of origin. So you're gaining a new knowing, the truth of origin. And the 7th moment is Dharma forbearance of, subsequent forbearance of origin. And then the 8th moment is subsequent forbearance of origin. Well, do you gain a new knowing then? Well, you already got subsequent knowing, so you can't gain that knowing. You already have knowing of origin, so you can't gain that. So you don't gain anything there. Well, you don't gain a new knowing, shall we say. You don't gain a new category of knowings. Of course, you've got a new level of wisdom, but you haven't gained what we'd classify as a new knowing. And then it's similar with knowing of cessation on the second moment of the 10th moment of the clear realization, that is Dharma knowing of cessation. Then you gain knowing cessation. And then on the 14th moment, the 14th moment, that is the Dharma forbearance, so Dharma knowing of path, you gain path knowing. And so that is what you gain. So you gain each of those, and you end up with 7 by the end of the path of seeing. And so on the path of meditation, they have those 7, if they are, as long as they are not detached, as long as they're still attached to the desire realm. Now, if they are detached, knowing minds is added to all of these. So you should just add 1, add telepathy. So they possess 2 on the first moment, relative and telepathy, and so on up to 8 on the path of meditation. So relative knowing, the Dharma and subsequent knowing, and the knowings of each of the 4 truths, and telepathy equals 8. Up to the path of meditation. Now, of course, they wouldn't have knowing non-arising and knowing extinction because they are not yet arhats. So a non-learner possesses the first 9 if of dull faculties, and all 10 if sharp. So this is talking about the possession of these. Now, possession and attainment are generally thought to be, in the second chapter, it says, attainment is to get or have. So possession and attainment are kind of the same. But it's kind of looking at it from a different one. I think this is looking at in terms of what you have at any given moment. The next section is talking about how the knowings are attained. And this is the third major section of the chapter, how the knowings are attained. This isn't looking at what you have any moment, but what moment you gain each different type of knowing. So this has 4 topics. So those attained during the path of seeing, those attained on other paths, that is the paths of meditation and no more learning, how many are attained from each path, and the classifications of their attainment. So those attained on the path of seeing, I wonder if I can get this all together. There we are. Oh, not quite. Okay, those attained on the path of seeing, as they arise on the path of seeing, future and forbearances and knowings like them are gained, and that upon 3 subsequent, the relative, and upon 3 subsequent, the relative 2. So as they arise, actually it'd be easier to just go through the commentary on this one. So thus they are called clear realizations, and they are non-arising dharmas on its own and other lower levels. Cessations is the last. Their own truths aspects born of effort. So at what points are how many knowings attained? So as the 8 forbearances and 7 knowings arise on the path of seeing, when they arise, the future similar forbearances and knowings like them are gained in their own time. In other words, when you get Dharma forbearance of suffering, then you also attain future Dharma forbearance of suffering. When you get Dharma knowing of suffering, then you gain future Dharma knowing of suffering. And you gain them at that time, during that moment of the path. So thus, when the Dharma forbearance of dukkha arises, the attainment of a future Dharma forbearance with similar focus and aspects arises, and so forth. For the attached, the level is only not unable. So you're on the level of not unable. And for the detached, that is those who are free of attachment to the desire realm, it's on any of the 6 levels, as we've gone through before: the not unable, the 4 dhyana, or the special dhyana. So one attains the forbearance of 2 times, that is present and future, for the level of one's bodily support. You attain only the future forbearance of other levels, not the present, but it does not become manifest because multiple paths of seeing do not arise. So basically it's saying you get the forbearance and you achieve it for now and for the future, but it's never going to happen in the future. Why is it not going to happen? Because you only go through the path of seeing once. But another way of, and it's when you say it like that, it sounds kind of ridiculous. Well, why would we bother to say this? But when you think about it another way, it's like saying, you have that knowing, you have that forbearance. It's a quality that you actually have. And so you don't lose it in the future. So basically it's saying that it's there, you don't need it, but it's there. On the path of seeing itself, upon three subsequent knowings, the subsequent knowing of suffering, the subsequent knowing of origin, and subsequent knowing of cessation, the relative knowing is attained too. Now you already have relative knowing, but what you are gaining now is a particular type of relative knowing, the relative knowing that you have completely seen those three truths: the suffering, origin, and cessation. So then when you've gone through and you get to the level of subsequent knowing of Dharma, then you realize a subsequent knowing of suffering, then you have the realization, oh, I've clearly realized the truth of suffering. And the same with origin and the same with cessation. It doesn't mean that you've completely manifested everything yet, but you have seen. So it is not attained on Dharma knowing because the truth has not been clearly realized to its full extent. Because on Dharma knowing, you haven't realized it for the higher realms yet. So that's on the first three paths. It's on the path of, the first three truths, suffering, origin, and cessation, but not on path. So why not? Well, it's because the truth of path itself is it's much more extensive. And you've realized the four aspects of the fourth noble truth. You've seen the truth, but you haven't seen the entire path, excuse me. So the truth, and you couldn't have previously seen it because it is not clearly realized by the previous worldly path. In other words, if you had already gone through the worldly paths and achieved even the peak of existence, you wouldn't have realized the entire path. And when you're on the 16th moment of clear realization, the first moment of the path of meditation, there's still a lot of meditation that you haven't got to know. Although if you'd known it, you'd already be there. So you don't have that new special worldly special relative knowing then. So the truth of the path itself is not clearly realized by the previous worldly path, and the truth has not been seen clearly, has not been clearly realized to its full extent. So you've realized it, but not in full. Thus the relative knowings that arise out of the subsequent knowings of suffering, origin, and cessation are called arisen from clear realization's end. In other words, when you get to the to the end of each of the four moments for those three truths, you have clearly realized everything that you can realize about those truths from seeing them. And they're called arisen from the clear realization's end because they arise from the end of, after the clear realization of each truth. So then the question is, well, do not these relative knowings that are arisen from the end of clear realization sometimes become manifest? And you ask, no, because they're non-arising dharmas, they do not become manifest. This is another one where you've got the capability, you know it, but you don't need it, but it's there. Now, the relative knowings of how many levels are attained, you say. Relative, so when you gain knowings, you have to wonder, well, what levels are you gaining for? Relative knowings are gained on the level that is the path of seeing's own and lower levels. So you're on the path of seeing, so if you're either on not enable, the four jhanas, or the special jhana, right? So if the path of seeing is on not enable, then you get the relative knowings of that level, that is not enable, and the lower level of desire. And similar, if you're on the first jhana, then you'd gain it for not enable and desire, as well as for the first jhana. The relative knowing arisen from the end of clear realization of cessation is the last of the four foundations of mindfulness, the mindfulness of dharmas. Why is that? Well, it's because knowing cessation is mindfulness of dharmas, as we explained before. The other two are all foundations of mindfulness, similar to the reasons we discussed a few minutes ago. These relative knowings arisen from the end of clear realization have their truth's own aspects, that is, impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless for suffering, has a causal origin, production, and conditions for origin, and peace, cessation, sublime, and emancipation for cessation. And they're attained on the level of the clear realization of that truth. Because they're attained by the path of seeing, they're born of effort, not through detachment. In other words, you have to, the path of seeing has a degree of effort to it. So therefore, they are born of effort. They don't just come from detaching yourself from a realm. So now we have the question, well, how many knowings are attained on the other paths? And so this is speaking about the paths of meditation and no more learning. Explaining those, we aren't talking about the paths of, we don't talk about the paths of accumulation and the paths of joining. And probably part of that is because all you have on those paths is relative knowing. So they don't go into that in detail. But when we're talking about the path of meditation, no more learning, there are points where you gain new knowings. So explaining those with different counts individually and explaining those similar counts together. So explaining those with different counts individually has two topics: how many are attained on the path of learning, and how many are attained on the path of no more learning. So how many are attained on the path of learning? This has 5 topics. How many are attained on the 16th moment? How many are attained on most of the path of meditation? Third is on the 8 paths of liberation from the peak of existence. And the fourth is on the learner's path of liberation when purifying faculties. And the 5th is on the paths of no obstacles of the peak of existence. So how many are attained on the 16th moment? Now, again, the 16th moment means the 16th moment of clear realization, which is the first moment of the path of meditation. So there's 2 points. First is the attached. That means people who still have attachment or desire for the desire realm. Attached gains 6 on the 16th. So on the 16th moment, if you're attached at that moment, you gain 6. Well, what are the 6 that you gain? Those who are attached to desire gain 6 knowings, the 4 knowings of the 4 truths, Dharma knowing, and subsequent knowing when abiding on the 16th moment, subsequent knowing of the path. So this is knowing that is liberated from the discards of seeing, but it is not liberated from the discards of meditation because it's mere abiding in the result. So remember, when you move from one level to the next, you forfeit the previous levels and you gain new ones. It's like you've got deeper understanding, is a way of thinking about it. You've got a new, deeper understanding. Because subsequent knowing of the path is by nature path knowing and subsequent knowing, those are attained in the present. So when you have the path knowing and subsequent knowing, those are present, but the other 4 are attained in the future only. At that moment, you're not focused on the desire realm, or the 3 other truths, so you don't gain those in the present, but you gain them for the future. Because these individuals are attached, it is on the level of not unable. So you're only doing this meditation on the level of not unable if you're attached. It is so therefore these 4 on the level of not attached, of not unable. It is produced by completing seeing, so it is attained from the expansion or the development of a cause of similar status. In other words, of the different types of causes described, this comes from a cause of similar status. It's not full ripening and so forth. It's a cause of similar status. Or it's not a compatible result. Similar status means that they're in the same class. The class here being defiled. They do not attain knowing others' minds or telepathy because they are attached to desire. Therefore, they don't have telepathy yet. Relative knowing is not attained because what has already been acquired is not acquired. It has already been acquired. Knowing extinction and not arising are not acquired because they are learners. You don't get that until you are an arhat or a non-learner. So that is if you are attached. Now, what about if you're detached? That is free of desire for the desire realm. The text reads, those detached from desire gain 7. Oh, you get those detached from desire realm gain 7 because they get telepathy too, a bonus. Knowing 7 others' minds, you get in addition into the previous 6. So the same 6 plus telepathy. So that's on the first moment of the path of meditation. So the rest of the path of meditation, how many do you get? So this is 2 points, the attached. Later on the paths of meditation, the attached attain the 7 knowings. So later, after the 16th moment, the subsequent knowing of path, then on the paths of meditation, that is all the paths of joining obstacles, liberation and distinction. That means, as they're liberating, going through each of the sets of 81 discards for each of the the sets of 9 discards for each of the 9 levels, those 81 sets of discards. Then for each of those, there's a path of joining, no obstacles, liberation, distinction. Those who are attached to desire, when they're working to achieve the form realm, attain the 7 knowings: Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing, because of the 4 knowings of the 4 truths, and relative knowing. It's like each time you're getting kind of a new level of the knowing, so you're getting a new knowing. If it is a worldly path of meditation that views the aspects of peaceful and coarse, the present relative knowing arises. So you can free yourself from the desire realm through one of 2 ways. You can go through the defiled way, the worldly way, or the undefiled way. So the previous was speaking about the undefiled. Here now, if you're doing it through the worldly way, which is primarily relying on shamatha meditation and viewing the aspects of the lower realm as being coarse and coarse and harsh, and the higher realm as being peaceful and smoother, then the present relative knowing arises. However, if the path is transworldly, that is noble. Since subsequent knowing is not the antidote for desire, but Dharma knowing is, then Dharma knowing and knowing of one of the 4 truths arises in the present. Because at that point, you're meditating on one of the 4 truths, and you're on the desire realm, so you've got desire realm. The remaining knowings are attained in the future, because they develop the cause of same status of their own class. In other words, when you start meditating on the other truths, then they come out of the cause of similar status, the undefiled. The undefiled, which is the undefiled knowings are all kind of same status causes of subsequent knowings. They're all because they're all in the same class. As the individuals are attached and learners, the other 3 knowings are not attained. So the other 3 would include, what is the other 3? One moment, let me. The other 3 would be the telepathy and the knowing, knowing extinction and non-arising, those 3. So then for the detached, in victory over 7 levels, gaining clairvoyance and unshakable, paths of no obstacles for alternating. So when you're going over the next 7 levels, that is the 4 levels of form plus the first 3 of formless, or when you are gaining clairvoyances, the 6 types of the first 5 types of clairvoyances, or the refining your faculties to the unshakable, or when you're achieving the path of no obstacles for alternating. So in these moments, in the victory over the 7 levels of the 4 jhanas and of the 3 formless that detach ones from desire, and in gaining the 5 clairvoyances other than the extinction of defilements, which is only for non-learners, then learners attain 7 knowings. The Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing, knowing of the 4 truths, and relative knowing. So each of those, when you free yourself from the desire realm, you gain those 7. When you free yourself from the first and second and third and fourth forms, you gain those 7. Likewise, when you gain the clairvoyances, or when you refine your faculties to the when you do that, then you gain these 7 knowings. And on realizing and attaining the status of unshakable, you also gain 7 knowings, but they're a little bit different. The 6 undefiled that go with all and knowing extinction are attained, because unshakable is a status of arhat. So you don't. So you gain the 6 undefiled that go with any of these the families, and also knowing extinction. Relative knowing, knowing others' minds, and knowing non-arising are not attained. The first is not attained because the paths of refining are always undefiled. So you're refining your faculties; it's an undefiled path. You're not going to gain the defiled relative knowing, and there's no cause to attain anything else. The latter 2 are not attained because they're paths of liberation. In other words, they're attained later, after you when the moment you attain it is on a path of no obstacles. On any of the paths of no obstacles for the alternating meditation as well, the 6 undefiled and relative knowings are attained. So the other 3, the 6 undefiled are what? Not knowing the 4 truths, Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing for 6. The other 3 are not attained because you're not a non-learner, so they're not getting the latter 2, and it's not a path of liberation. So knowing others' minds is not attained. The knowing others' minds is only on the path of liberation, again, because it requires training, requires effort. How many are attained on the 8 paths of liberation from the peak of existence? 8 paths of liberation from the highest. On the first 8 paths of liberation that vanquish the level of the peak of existence that is higher than the other 7 levels, 7 knowings are attained. So the first 8 paths, this means you've got for the level of the peak of existence, you have 9 sets of meditation discards, right? As you discard the first 8 sets, you get 7 knowings on each of them, the 6 undefiled and telepathy, okay? It's kind of like, they're the same in name, but I think they're probably just different in degree. So you gain a new one each time you get a higher level. How many are attained on the learner's paths of liberation when purifying faculties? So that is on the paths of no obstacles. So on the paths of liberation, how is it? Remember, the path of no obstacles is the moment that you're overcome the obstacles. The path of liberation is the next moment when you realize, wow, that you're free. So on the learner's liberation of refining, so when you're refining your faculties, one gains 6 or else 7 knowings, or, well, maybe there's another tradition, something that says someone else, and you gain 6 on the paths of no obstacles. So when you're refining or purifying faculties, it says, on attached learner's paths of liberation of refining faculties, one gains 6 knowings: Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing, knowing suffering, origin, cessation, and path. Those are the 4 truths, right? So that's 6. Or else, if you are detached, then you add telepathy. Knowing others' minds or telepathy is added for a total of 7 knowings that you attain. The word "or" indicates that there is another tradition that says that both the attached and the detached also attain relative knowing when you refine. That's just another tradition. So on the paths of joining, they also both attain relative knowing. So this is on the path of joining. That is the training for refining your faculties. Whether the learner is attached or detached, 6 knowings are attained above on paths of no obstacles for refining faculty. So on the path of no obstacles for refining the faculty, you gain 6. That would be the 6 undefiled ones. So the undefiled, except for knowing extinction and non-arising, because they're a learner, but not relative knowing. Relative knowing is not attained because this is similar to the path of seeing. So knowing others' minds is also not attained because it is blocked on all paths of no obstacles. Why it is blocked? Why is it blocked, you ask? Because it is not an antidote. The path of no obstacles is an antidote, and the telepathy is not an antidote, so it can't happen on that path. How many are attained on the paths of no obstacles for the peak of existence? Well, when you're vanquishing the peak, then on the path of no obstacles, likewise, it's the same. As with the previous, likewise, on the path of no obstacles that vanquish the peak of existence, only those 6 are attained. Again, those 6, the Dharma and subsequent knowing, and the 4 noble for each of the 4 truths. So on the path of no more learning, how do you gain? How many are attained on the path of no more learning? That means the first moment is is the Vajra-like samadhi. Then the next moment when you're free on the path of when you're on the path of no more learning, which is then how many do you gain? There are 3 points. The dull faculties. On knowing extinction, there are 9. Upon knowing extinction, knowing, oh, I've done it all, there are 9 knowings that those with dull faculties gain, because you have, well, everything except for knowing non-arising. So why are we, what about the 10th one, knowing non-arising? Well, it's excluded. Knowing non-arising is excluded because it's possible they might regress. Because we talked about all the different types of arhats. So if you're of dull faculties, there's a possibility you might lose it. So you don't have the knowing that there's no more to learn, because you might have to relearn something. You might have to go back to your remedial class or something, I don't know. The sharp faculties, if you're the unshakable, The unshakable attains 10 knowings. The unshakable one, who also attains the knowing of non-arising, attains 10. Because they know that they're not going to have to relearn anything. So how many are attained on the paths of refining faculties? When you are on that level of no more learning, then how many do you gain? Well, refining there on the last as well. So when refining there, that is to unshakable, all are attained on the last path of freedom, that is the path of liberation as well. At that time, you also gain all 10. So now then there are all those, and then there are those with similar count together. So there are a whole bunch of other moments that haven't been mentioned. To explain them all together, 8 are attained on those not mentioned. So 8 knowings, excluding knowing, extinction, and non-arising, are attained on all those remaining paths that were not previously mentioned. The 9 paths of liberation from the desire for desire, the paths of liberation for desire for the 7 levels, the paths of liberation for the 5 clairvoyances, and the meditation on and alternating the dharmas, the first 8 paths of liberation that create the realization of unshakable, and the paths of joining for detachment and the distinctive paths. In other words, in all these points, you get the 8. The 9 liberations from the path of desire, you gain 8 knowings on each of these different times, basically excluding, most of them you're excluding the, what do we say? Excluding the knowing non-arising and non-arising and extinction. So on the non-learner's paths of joining, liberation, and distinction for clairvoyance, when you're developing your clairvoyance, then occasional non-learners attain 9 knowings, excluding non-arising. So occasional ones, non-learners are what? They're ones who might regress. They're the duller faculties. They gain 9, excluding non-arising. Non-occasional non-learners attain all 10 because they know they're not going to regress. They also have the knowing non-arising. On the paths of no obstacles for the clairvoyances and alternating meditation, the occasional attain the 8 that exclude knowing of non-arising and telepathy of and non-others' minds. The occasional attain the 9 excluding the knowing of non-arising. So, these are just saying which of the knowings do you gain on which moment. And so I think this is not the for our present purposes. This is actually not all that difficult if you sit down and read and think. And also, it's what do we say? It's not the most immediately helpful right now. So if you're going to study Abhidharma in more depth in the future, you can go through and think about these. There aren't a whole lot of disputes about them. You just have to kind of think about what is the nature of each knowing, what is the nature of each moment, and then we kind of put it together too. It's like, oh, okay, well that makes sense. And also, of course, if you want a little bit of a help on that, you can also look at the Chim Abhidharma, the ornament of Abhidharma. By Chim Jamyang. So how many are attained from each path? One gains them where one is detached, on which is gained in lower 2. So you gain them on the level of where you're detached, that you're detaching from. You gain it on the level that you're attained it on the level that you were reaching, and also on the lower levels. On knowing extinction defiled 2, on all levels. Those previously gained are not attained. So, on which paths are how many levels knowings attained, you ask? To consider relative knowing first. When attaining a level, one attains the future relative knowings that are on the level of the path, and the path, that is what level you're on when you're doing the meditation, and the level that has been attained for the very first time. For example, when you are on the level of not unable, the preparation for the first jhana, and you achieve the first jhana. When you achieve the first jhana, you gain a relative level knowing for the level of not unable, and also for the level of the first jhana. And these are future ones. At that moment, you're not actually thinking about the relative. You're thinking, because you're on the path on an undefiled path, you're actually focusing on the undefiled. So you gain the future ones. So that means on that level, you're gaining both the not unable and the first jhana. So undefiled knowings are attained not just on the levels on the path. So the defiled, you get it on the level of the path and the level you're of achieving. And on the undefiled levels, you get it on other levels as well. So, well, then you say, how is it then, you ask? One gains them, that is the undefiled knowings, on the levels where one has become detached through both defiled and undefiled paths of joining and so on, and on that level which is gained, and the lower levels undefiled knowings are attained too. So when the level where one has become detached through both defiled and undefiled paths of joining, then, like again, the example is if you are on the level of not unable and you are freeing yourself from the desire realm, then at the moment that you do that, you gain the you gain the defiled and undefiled, the relative and the dharma and subsequent knowings, etc., for the desire realm that you have left, and also for the first jhana, which you have newly gained. On knowing, excuse me, not for the you gain them for the level. I mean, you gain them for not unable and for the first jhana. And the lower levels, undefiled knowings, are attained too. So that means the desire realm. On knowing extinction, the defiled qualities attained by knowing extinction are attained too. So the qualities of all levels of repulsive meditation, the mindfulness of the in-breath and out-breath, and so on, are attained in a similar way to cutting the cords that bind a basket. It's like, or releasing one's breath. It's just like, first they're all confined, and then just, you have a basket and you have it wrapped up tightly in cord, you cut the cord and the basket just springs back to shape. Or if you're letting your breath go, then you see it. So here, to what yeah, okay. So just as when a king gains a large kingdom, the people of the country welcome him with offerings of gift. When the kingdom that is not under control of the afflictions is gained in the mind. So when you achieve the kingdom of actual control over your mind, you're welcomed with a gathering of all the qualities, the virtuous qualities. In other words, you gain all of the different powers of meditation with that. So how many are attained? Only those not previously acquired are attained. Those that have been previously gained are not attained. So you only gain new ones then. But you also does not attain those from which one has regressed, because you have forfeited the attainment. So you aren't gaining those from that you have regressed. Okay. Well, I think that is probably enough for this morning. And again, this was a bit that we went through more quickly, but as I have said before, I've explained why I went through it quickly. And tomorrow we have class tomorrow. Today is what, Friday? So tomorrow we will get into the qualities of the Buddha. So, and I think there's a question here. Question about clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is, the question reads, as ordinary human beings, there are times when one knows a friend or family member is danger or ill without having connected to them directly. You sense that person or you think of them and suddenly they call. Is that natural clairvoyance? Or since we possess Buddhahood, that we have all have the potential of breaking through? This is a very interesting question. And generally, the levels of telepathy or clairvoyance and so forth, I do think that this happens, and I think many of us experience at moments when you kind of something's going to happen. Something has happened. You know that there's a problem. And then, as the questioner says, you hear. So is this telepathy? Is this clairvoyance? What is it? And it's not clearly described in the Abhidharma, or it doesn't seem to fit clearly in any of the categories. On the other hand, we can look at it, and it's clear in the Abhidharma that anyone who goes through and does these meditations is able to achieve these powers. So that must mean that there is some natural capacity that we have. And there are also times when that natural capacity just comes out naturally by its own nature. For example, when you are in the bardo after you have died and you have gone into the bardo, you have telepathy just by your nature. You have the miracles of speed and so forth. You can go where you think in the bardo. This just naturally happens. So it's actually a capacity that all beings have that in our present condition we can't really access until we train and do it. Or, for example, if you are born as a god, then you will achieve the divine ear, the divine eye, and so forth, and some of the clairvoyances just by nature. So there's a difference between the clairvoyances that come by nature and those that come from training. And it's discussed a little bit in chapters 3 and chapter 4, and we will discuss it. I think it comes up a little bit at the end of this chapter as well. But in other words, I think it's a question that we all have the potential for it. And so that for that potential to kind of, what do we say, leak through the thick covering of our obscurations from time to time is just not surprising. It's just the way things happen. So that is my conjecture about how it is. Because if we didn't have potential, we couldn't do it. It's not like you're adding anything new. Even in the foundation vehicle, where there's just no discussion of Buddha nature, everyone still has the potential. All sentient beings still have the potential to achieve arhatship. We all have potential to achieve the qualities. We might be dull faculties right now, but we could change our faculties. So we all have potential for all of this. And I think that potential sometimes just happens to show through. I think that's how that happens. Okay, so we will now recite the dedication and aspiration prayers. So I'd like to ask you to please dedicate the merit that we have all gathered by listening and contemplating the Dharma this morning to the benefit of all sentient beings, so they may swiftly achieve Buddhahood and be freed from all of the sufferings, the long-term and the short-term sufferings of samsara. Osanam de tamje sepani tomnenye pedranam pamchete Jegana chivalong trubai Sibetole drogunyo. By this merit may we attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, and free all beings swiftly from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Chanchub samjo rinpoche make panam ke juraji ke pa nyamba me baryang gongne gondu pelwar sho. May bodhicitta great and precious arise in those who have not roused it, never weakening in those who have. May it grow ever stronger and stronger. Thank you very much.